Hello, hello, everyone. Brian's Winter, Chapter 5. The morning dawned cold. More ice around the edge of the lake, and the geese and ducks were flying almost constantly now. And after he rekindled the fire, Brian went to work at once on the rabbit skins. He folded the rectangle over on itself with the fur on the inside and sewed up the sides, leaving 2 holes about 6 inches across at the top on each side. Then cut a large hole large enough for his head in the fold and pulled the whole thing down over his head, sticking his arms through the holes as he did so. It made a perfect vest. Well, he thought, looking down at himself, maybe not perfect. It actually looked pretty tacky, with bits of dried flesh still stuck to the hides here and there in the crude lacing. But it was warm, very warm, and within moments he was sweating and realized that it was more than he needed and had to take it off. He set it aside and was about to get back to work on the arrows. He still had to fletch them, put feathers on the shafts, when he remembered the wolves. He trotted up to mark his boundary stump and came across a corner near the stump and stopped dead. Facing him was a wolf, a big male, his head covered with fresh blood. He was holding a large piece of meat with a bone in the center in his mouth, and he didn't growl or look at Brian with anything but mild curiosity. They stood that way, Brian with no weapon and nothing in his mind but peeing on a stump, and the wolf holding the meat. And then the wolf turned and trotted off to the left and was gone. But he had come from the right, Brian thought, somewhere to the right. And as he watched, another wolf came by from the right with another piece of meat, though slightly smaller, and trotted easily off to the left, following the first one. And Brian was alone. He stood waiting, and when no more wolves came, he relaxed his shoulders, which had been straining, and thought of what he had just seen. They must have been the wolves that had sung the night before just as he went to sleep. They had hunted well, and he smiled, thinking how they must feel, how he felt when it went well. And turned to go to his stump when he thought again. They had been carrying meat, fresh meat. He did not know what kind it was, but it must have been a large animal, maybe a deer, and they seemed to be done with it. Maybe there's something left of the kill, he thought. If I can find it, maybe there's something left I can use. He started off the way the wolves had come, but stopped again, thought a moment, then trotted back to camp and got his knife and hatchet and fire-hardened spear. Knowing the woods as he did, he knew there was a chance that he would not be the only thing looking at the wolves' kill. He started back up in the direction the wolves had come from and hadn't gone 100 yards when he came to it. It had been a deer, a young doe. There were dozens around, and Brian had thought of hunting them, but his weapons were light, and it was hard to get close to them. So he settled for rabbits and fish and fool birds. She had been the crash he had heard in the night when the wolves had howled, and he stopped before the kill to read sign. The doe was on the near side of a small clearing. She must have run out of the far side with the wolves nearly on her, and they had caught her and held her while they tore at her to kill her. She must have thrashed around a good deal because the grass was bloody across 30 or so feet and the ground was torn up, but they'd taken her down. Brian could see her tracks where they'd come into the clearing, and where the dirt was torn he could see the wolf tracks, and he closed his eyes for a moment and imagined what it must have been like. The deer running through the brush, the wolves gaining, then setting their teeth in her and dragging her back and down. He shook his head and came back to reality. Most of her was gone. They had started at the rear, pulling and eating, and had taken both back legs off and up into the guts, as well as chewing at the neck. All that was really left was the head and neck and front shoulders and tattered bits of hide, the whole thing looking like a roadkill hit by a semi. Brian smiled. It's a treasure, he thought, and actually started to salivate and then smile more widely as he had a fleeting image of back in the world and what they would think if they could see him now salivating over what amounted to a roadkill. He would have to work fast. Other predators, a bear, foxes, perhaps more wolves could come along at any moment, and until he got to the protection of the fire, he wasn't sure he could hold his new wealth. The portion of the doe that was left weighed less than 50 pounds, and he dragged it easily at first. But then, seeing that it left a blood mark as it skidded along, and worried that it would be too easy to follow, he picked up the carcass and threw it over his shoulder and carried it. At the shelter, he put it down and put more wood on the fire and took out his knife. First, it would have to be skinned. The skin toward the rear was torn and shredded where the wolves had ripped and fed, but it was largely whole on her chest and neck, and he worked carefully, first to cut down from the underside of her chin to the middle of her chest. And here was his first surprise. Rabbits were easy to skin. The hide almost fell off them. The doe's skin was stuck tight to the meat and did not come off with simply pulling at it, the way a rabbit skin did. Brian had to use the tip of the knife to cut the skin away from the flesh, peeling it back 1/4 of an inch at a time, and it took him the better part of an hour, working constantly to get the hide loose, cutting it off the front legs and up the neck to the back of the head. The doe's eyes bothered him at first. They were large and brown and open, seemed to be watching him as he turned and cut and pulled. He apologized for what had happened to her, what he was doing to her. It did not ease his comfort, but he hoped the spirit of the deer knew what he was feeling, and he promised that none of what was there would be wasted. And what a lot of it there was, more than he'd seen since he crashed. The hide, much tougher and thicker than the rabbit skins, was big enough to nearly make another vest, and he laid it near the side of his shelter to dry while he worked at the meat. The wolves had fed until they were gorged and must have then taken what they could carry back to their den. But he was amazed at how much meat there was left. He started cutting it off in strips, lean red meat, which he laid on a flat rock. Just off one shoulder there was more meat than he'd ever seen together in one place outside a supermarket. A good 6 or 7 pounds with no bone in it, and then the other shoulder, and then on top going up the neck, and when it was finally done, just at dark, he figured he had 25 or 30 pounds of meat. He made a huge stew, boiling close to 6 pounds of meat, sitting by the fire in his rabbit skin vest as the evening chill came down. Then he ate and ate and ate, and when he was done there was still meat and broth left. He dozed, slept, and awakened in the middle of the night and ate some more, drank some more of the broth, and there was still some left. He awakened in the morning with a stomach still bulging full and grease on his lips and something close to joy in his heart. He was not done with the body of the doe. The head bothered him, the way her eyes seemed to see things, and he separated it from the neck bones and took it up and set it in the fork of a tree well off the ground and looking out over the lake. He wasn't sure why, but it seemed the right thing to do, and he thanked her again for her meat before turning back to work. The freezes at night had done away with the flies, so they didn't bother the meat, and he spread the pieces out to give them air, and by the middle of the afternoon he could see they were drying into a kind of jerky in the sun. But before that he went to work on the bones. There was still a lot of meat on them, and he chopped them up with a hatchet and kept a pot boiling all day to boil the meat and marrow from them. When it was finally done, again in late afternoon, he was surprised to see the liquid in the pot become semi-hard like jello and turn into a thick mass full of bits of cooked meat. This he ate for the evening meal, or about half of it, spooning it in thick gallops, and when he was at last back in his shelter, the meat stored safely in the rear and the pot set aside from the fire for their night, still half full, he felt like the richest man on earth. It was very hard to concentrate on working. Everything in him wanted to sleep now. He'd never been so full, and the shelter was warm and snug, and all he really wanted to do was close his eyes and sleep and end the day. But he could not forget the bear attack, or the rain and cold, and he knew that the good weather and his luck wouldn't last, and he had really no time to waste. He took the arrows out and rummaged around in the survival pack for his feather stash. He had found early on that fool bird feathers from the wing and tail worked the best for arrows, and he had saved every wing and tail feather from every fool bird that he had shot, and he took them out now. These arrows were different. They were heavier, and he worried the width of the point would catch the air and counteract the feathers in some way. The solution, he felt, was to make the feathers longer. He selected only 2 feathers for each arrow, but left them a full 6 inches long, and shaved a flat side with the knife, the full length of each feather, so that it would fit in the arrow shaft. He attached the arrows with pieces of thread from his old windbreaker, wrapping them at the front and the rear, and then smearing them with bits of warmed pine sap. A trick he had learned when he had leaned against some sap on a tree and stuck to it to protect the thread. He did 3 arrows, working slowly and carefully before going at last to sleep. Once again he slept so hard that he awakened with his head jammed into the ground and his neck stiff from not moving all night. Because of all the meat from the doe, he did not have to hunt for days now, at least 10 or 12, maybe 2 weeks, and he worked all day on the arrows and bow, sitting next to the shelter in the warm sun, snacking on the jellied meat now and then. By dark this day, all 9 arrows were finished. He had used the hunting knife as a scraper to shape the limbs of the bow more equally, and to put in notches for the string to get it ready to string the next day for the first shooting trials. He was just leaning back, half cocky about how well things were going, when he smelled the skunk. The skunk! He had run into skunks before, of course, saw them all the time, but had only one really bad experience when he got sprayed directly. He knew they moved at night hunting and didn't seem very afraid of anything. He looked out of the shelter opening carefully. The skunk wasn't 4 feet away, looking in at him, at the shelter and the fire, and as he watched, it whipped up its rear end and tipped its tail over and aimed directly at his face. "I'm dead," he thought, and froze. For a long time they stayed that way, Brian holding his breath, waiting to be nailed, and the skunk aiming at him. But the skunk didn't spray, just aimed and held it. "He's hungry," Brian thought. "That's all. He's hunting, and he's hungry." Slowly, Brian reached to his right where the meat was stored back in the corner and took a piece of the venison. With a smooth, slow movement, he tossed the meat out to the right of the skunk. For a split second he thought it was over. The skunk's tail jerked when the meat hit the ground, but then its nose twitched as it smelled it, and it lowered its tail, turned, and started eating the meat. Brian carefully reached out to the side and pulled the door back over the opening and left the skunk outside, eating. "Great," he thought, crawling back into his bag to sleep. "I've got a pet skunk who's a terrorist. If I quit feeding him, he'll spray me. Just great." His eyes closed and he sighed. Maybe he'll be gone in the morning. And that is the end of chapter 5. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace. Bye.